So just a couple reminders. We're in week 5 today, and you have a response paper due on Thursday at 11:59 p.m. uploaded to Turnitin. So the response paper is on questions around testimony, so this is not going to actually be anything that I talk about today is actually not included in this response paper. I also posted the slides for today already here, so you have them. And just to remind you that Thursday lecture is canceled. Rather, I condensed the 2 lectures into today's lecture, so it'll be full, to be sure, due to a travel conflict that I have. So sections still meet on Friday as per normal, and Thursday paper is due uploaded to Turnitin. Any questions, logistical things before we get started? No? I want to remind you about 2 other things. The media resources here at the bottom. So the next 2 weeks, meaning next week and the following, we're spending 4 sessions on film. So 2 weeks on Schindler's List, 1 week on Schindler's List, and 1 week on Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah. And if you click on media resources, you should be able to stream these videos under video reserves here. And Schindler's List is here, as well as the different parts of Shoah. You should look at the syllabus very carefully for exactly the sections of Shoah that you should watch. The film itself is 9.5 hours long. I'm not asking you to watch 9.5 hours. I'm asking you to watch about 2 hours. But there's particular sections that I identified that I think are most relevant for some of the issues that we're going to deal with in our class. So that's the next 2 weeks looking forward. And there really are very few additional readings other than what's on the syllabus, which are largely links to background information, for example, about Oskar Schindler and information about Lanzmann's film. Okay? Good. So the topic today is resistance. And it's a topic that I think we've circled around on a number of occasions in the class already, and also perhaps confronted in a way in which we maybe threw up our hands and said, you know, it wasn't possible for people to resist. The Nazis were they created a totalitarian system that was so absolute that no one could resist it, no one could do anything. And certainly the system had absolutist components. Certainly it was totalitarian in the way in which it enforced its policies and enforced terror. But there were opportunities for resistance, and often those resistance happen at many different levels, and I want to talk about those levels today. On one level, you have individuals who, so to speak, go against the tide. Those individuals often risk their lives and their livelihood to either help to save Jews or perhaps to stand up against policies that they disagreed with. You also have the level of police and organizations like the church, particularly the Catholic Church. You have monasteries and convents, and you have organizations that made a decision at various points in their existence to either collaborate or not collaborate with the Nazis. And then you also have whole countries. And you often have, in the case of the countries we're going to talk about, Denmark, Sweden, and Bulgaria, very different situations that gave rise to opportunities for the government to enact policies that went against the explicit demands of Hitler, Eichmann, and others who wanted to deport the Jews. And so we'll look at all these different levels, from individuals to organizations to governments, and try to assess what resistance looked like and meant. As a starting point, I'm going to actually just mention briefly a particular person who's located, you can barely see in that photo there, in a swarm of hundreds of thousands, probably tens of thousands at least, Nazis saluting Hitler in a famous Sieg Heil salute. You have one guy standing there with his arms crossed in 1936. This photograph has since become somewhat famous because people want to know, who is this guy? How could he just stand there almost like sullen amidst the crowd of people cheering jubilantly? You might think of Leni Riefenstahl's film, where all they do is pan the masses of people who are just enthusiastic, right? Overwhelmed with jubilance about Hitler. And there's August Landmesser standing there, somewhat sullen, arms crossed. Turns out he was married to, or he wanted to marry, his Jewish wife. Turned out the Nuremberg laws specifically prevented this in 1935. Turned out he was imprisoned for being a race defiler, meaning he and his wife had had children. And because you have an Aryan German and a Jewish wife, he in fact was imprisoned, and his wife was eventually taken off to a camp where she was killed. This is before that happened. This is 1936. But the Nuremberg laws were already enacted in 1935. He was already beginning to struggle, so to speak, with what it would mean to go against the tide. And I think that this very photograph already indicates something which we could read as a single person realizing because of their identity and their relationship, already one begins to think, what does resistance look like? In this case, it's simply just crossing one's arms. It's not anything more than that. But of course, resistance took many other forms that were substantially more proactive. And that's where I want to go today. So we're going to look at a number of people, and some of them are along the bottom here. This is Raoul Wallenberg, Pastor Martin Niemöller, Dimitar Pechev from Bulgaria, Sophie Scholl, a student activist, Shiuni Sugihara, a Japanese consul, general stationed in Lithuania, and finally Irina Sendler, who worked for a Polish underground and saved, estimates are around 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto. But the question I want us to confront is really, what can individuals, organizations, government officials do in the face of Nazi policies and Nazi violence? What did they have to risk? And how does resistance and solidarity take many different forms? Because it's not as if resistance always looked the same. And it's also because people often had to find ways that they could navigate a means within the tide of terror. At the top there, the Rising Fist is a photo montage by John Hartfield, and we'll talk about him first because he was one of the first to create explicitly anti-fascist caricatures, montages, you could say anti-fascist propaganda, but it was certainly anti-fascist art, which was meant to destabilize the Nazi message. So resistance in Germany took a number of different forms. We're going to start with Germany, and then we're going to broaden out. You see it among intellectuals, you see it among artists, you see it among students. You see it among the Catholic Church, to a certain extent the Lutheran Church, which is where Niemöller was, certain pastors and convents. You see it among political dissidents and the communists, and to a certain extent among everyday people, and we'll talk a little bit about this. And yet, I want you to think and remember that much of the population did not resist. That is to say, many people took a much more passive wait-and-see attitude, a kind of sense of assuming a sort of bystander perspective, precisely because of the privilege, as we talked about last time, the privilege of being a bystander. That is to say, if you're not targeted, you have this position of privilege which assures that you, your family, your livelihood is okay. And so one begins to wonder, too, about the moral stance of a bystander who looks the opposite direction but doesn't actually perpetrate the crimes. Should also say, just to remind you, again, Hitler didn't win a majority, right? He won 37% of the vote at the peak. And so you have 63% of the population who ostensibly were, not voting for him. And so resistance even existed in those years in which he came to power. So starting with John Hartfield, this is, maybe you've seen some of his photo montages before. He comes out of a tradition of Dada and New Objectivity, someone who took the techniques of a photo montage, meaning a photograph that you then bring pieces together. So you literally montage different images and words together in order to undermine, I would say, some of the idioms and mottos of the Nazi Party. He was on the side of the communists. He was expressly publishing in a communist illustrated weekly called the Workers' Illustrated Weekly, Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung, in Berlin until 1933. This publication was censored when Hitler came to power. All kind of anti-fascist art and expression was deemed inappropriate, wouldn't be tolerated. The publication went to Prague and stayed there till 1938. So what you have here is, an example of, taking of course, the swastika, dripping it in blood, calling it, saying that the old slogan of the new Reich, blood and iron. Well, it's a reference, of course, to Bismarck, the founding Reich of modernity. But of course, what the Nazis do is they take the blood and iron, the modernization of Germany, and turn it into terror, dripping in blood. Or in the case of Hitler here, he's swallowing coins. He's taking money from big industry. Swallowing coins, it says Adolf Hitler, the Superman, swallows gold and speaks barf. Basically just sprays, garbage out of his mouth. So you could imagine, this is the beginning of trying to find an idiom, a language for taking some of Hitler's ideas, iconography, worldviews, and turning them upside down, critiquing them. Here's Göring, the henchman of the Third Reich, dripping in blood. This comes out shortly after the Reichstag fire. So you remember that really critical turning point. It happened so early in the Nazi seizure of power, which is a crisis moment, right? The Reichstag is on fire. Suddenly, this is exactly what gives rise to the enabling laws, the laws that get rid of constitutional freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, that all the protections that were there by the Weimar democracy are gone. And so Hartfield makes this caricature of Göring about his sort of role in this, that maybe the Nazis are actually complicit, perhaps, in this fire. The book burnings that happened in May of that year, a funny slogan as well with Goebbels down there, sort of fanning the flames, saying, if there's only more fire, we can produce more enlightenment. So essentially, what here is the old speech of Goebbels. It says, let us light new fires so that we can wake up the blinded masses. Oops. Why is that not going anywhere? There we go. Another one from Hartfield, again, trying to take some of the ideology of the Nazi race and really turn it on its head. So this is one which called Voice from the Swamp. So the Nazi party, all those, the grandness of the party, illuminated by Leni Riefenstahl. He says, guess what? After 3,000 years of all my careful inbreeding, the superiority of my race, we're a toad, right? This swamp creature coming forth. And so, many of this imagery, again, was meant to provide a criticism of the worldview of the Nazis. Another example of resistance happened through technology. And I had mentioned earlier how important technology was for Hitler in terms of using film and radio to get his message across. Down here, this is an insignia, this is not produced by Hartfield at the bottom there. What this is a kind of celebration of the power of radio by the Nazi regime. So they installed loudspeakers into many town squares throughout Germany so that Hitler's voice could be broadcasted live into public squares. And so literally this idea of putting a huge radio and having all the masses around it. So it says all of Germany hears the Führer through the people's receiver, like the people's radio. You can even imagine that very much this idea here of the technology, everyone's in step with our time. Everyone hears the same thing. They hear the speech, the voice of the Führer coming to their homes, being broadcasted in public places, but also private places. Well, it turns out that you could actually also broadcast things that would be disruptive. And so one of the things the Gestapo was very concerned with was what they called these underground radio broadcasters, these people that would essentially broadcast messages into Germany that would be subversive or anti-Nazi. And Hartfield wanted to give them a logo. So this fist with all of the kind of the lightning coming out of it was to celebrate the shortwave broadcasters who figured out a way in the 1930s to disrupt the Nazi worldview. And how did they do this? It's actually an interesting kind of physics problem. And I'll just kind of show you what this is. They realized that radio signals, normally shortwave signals, would fall very close to where they're sent. So here you have a station at the top there. A shortwave signal would fall very close to where it was broadcasted. But in the 1920s, there was a realization by a physicist by the name of Heaviside, who realized that way up in the Earth's atmosphere, something like 50 or 60 miles up there, is ionized gas, which reflects these shortwave signals significantly further than where they originally broadcasted. And so the idea would be that radio, people maybe in London, perhaps outside of Germany, in Poland or Prague, with shortwave signals could broadcast signals into Germany because they would be reflected at a significantly further distance than where they originally sent. And so he explained how this all worked. So it's, again, harnessing technology to essentially undermine Nazi message. A totally fascinating thing that was only realized in the 1920s. So where Goebbels and Hitler would celebrate radio as the eighth wonder of the world, he says, Goebbels says, the most important and influential intermediary between a spiritual movement and a nation, between the idea and the people, that German revolution, the Nazi revolution, would not have been possible without the radio and the airplane. And remember, they bring those two together, in Leni Riefenstahl's film. It turns out the radio was not just a force of propaganda, but it had this other possibility. And I think that's really interesting about any technology. Any technology is not just that it can be appropriated in the face of, say, authoritarianism, but it can also be used to undermine. And so what Hartfield and those shortwave broadcasters were doing, were almost looking for the dialectical underbelly of the radio. It's not just a one-directional thing, but it can actually be used in an interesting way to undermine a message. And that's precisely, what they did, or tried to do. Okay. I have a number of things I'm going to cover today, so I'm going to kind of move quickly, but I want to kind of look a little more broadly beyond artists in Germany. I'm going to talk a little about churches. And one of the things that is really still a source of a lot of scholarship is really the role of the Catholic Church, not so much in its alliance with Hitler, but more of what they did and didn't do, what they could have done in particular. And this is, I think, something that's always been, it's been a real kind of stain in some ways on the church, but also a real struggle. So Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany didn't openly oppose Nazism, didn't openly speak out. Hitler was not, he himself was Catholic, but was not really a practicing Christian. He felt that in many ways the Catholic churches were in some ways a bit of an enemy to the Nazi ideology. And in fact, it's largely because they didn't get in line with supporting Nazism over Christian faith. And so when they did speak out, they usually spoke out against Nazi policies concerning euthanasia, sterilization, a program called the T4 program, which was killing of people who are mentally and physically handicapped or disabled. And within Germany alone, this program by the early 1940s had killed tens of thousands of people. They were euthanized in hospitals and other places. The church did speak out in this regard. And in fact, over the course of the 1930s, hundreds of priests were sent to Dachau, Sachsenhausen, other camps in Germany because of their opposition to Nazism. Some of the major Catholic resistors, particularly ones who were advocating for Jews through the Catholic Action Program, were killed in the Night of the Long Knives, which was a major purging effort in 1934 of dissidents in Nazi Germany. And we know of Catholic aid organizations throughout Germany, Italy, France, Poland that help Jews primarily through hiding Jews and taking them in. And I'll turn to that in a moment. Should also say that a group of, a particular sect of Christians was targeted by the Nazis, Jehovah's Witnesses, primarily because, one, of their pacifism, second, because their refusal to serve in the military, which goes obviously hand in hand with that, and the refusal to recognize Hitler as a supreme leader. And so approximately 2,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were sent to concentration camps, many from within Germany. It's not known exactly how many died, but a substantial number did, primarily through malnourishment and disease. So one church that did resist within Nazi Germany was what's called the Confessing Church. And this was a Lutheran sect established in the 1930s that spoke out against Nazification of the churches. And so its main advocates here are Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who are on the right there. Martin Niemöller is perhaps most famous nowadays because of this a slogan, so to speak, that he penned. Many people have this on posters, I guess, in their rooms, but it's really a quite, I think, still substantial and telling. It's a telling kind of meditation on what it means to stand up against violence. So he's the one who penned, first they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak. So this has gone through many revisions. He wrote this many different ways and many different times. In fact, Hitler personally made sure that Niemöller was imprisoned in Dachau. He was imprisoned the entire time, all the way till 1945. Once he began to speak out against Nazism and particularly say that the values of the church, its Christian faith and values, its allegiance to God and Scripture, are first and foremost not to Hitler. And because of this, and because he led essentially a kind of resistance in this regard to Hitler, he was imprisoned. He did survive the war, in fact had lived for decades after, whereas Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not, partially because he, not only in his opposition to Nazism, was also involved in supporting an assassination attempt in June of 1944 against Hitler. It was a failed assassination attempt and was imprisoned and executed shortly before the end of the war in 1945. If we look a little bit broader about the role of churches in hiding Jews, what you find is that convents, monasteries, Catholic orphanages and aid societies throughout Germany, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Italy, Poland had sheltered and taken in Jews. And perhaps the numbers that have been given are widely variable, but usually hundreds of thousands of people are attributed to be saved because of the role of different Catholic networks throughout Europe. So this is throughout all of Europe. In particular, a couple that were famous that I want to mention, and I'll talk about Zgoda in particular towards the end of our lecture today, but the Assisi Network in Italy, which was a network of different convents and monasteries. There was almost like an underground railroad of sorts for helping to save Jews and particularly children. A council in Poland called Council to Rescue Jews, Zgoda, established by Catholic activists in Poland, generally considered to saved around 50,000 Jews in Poland, which is about half the Jews that were saved in Poland during the entire period of the Holocaust. Now remember, we're talking about 3 million or so that were killed, so we're talking about 50,000 or so that were saved by this one organization. And they did so by working a network of convents and orphanages that took in Jews, that hid them in churches, that hid them in convents, and in particular, working to smuggle children out of the Warsaw Ghetto and placing them with adoptive families, almost all Catholic families. Should also say, within Italy, the Vatican offered some protection to Jews and also worked with many Italian Catholics to take in Jews into their homes. And in the case of Italy, the vast majority of the Jews in Italy, 40,000 out of around 50,000, survived the war, primarily because of efforts of I'd say the Catholic Church and its networks, but also because the Italian police didn't collaborate with Hitler and Eichmann and others to round up Jews. And this is remarkable because most cases the police did collaborate. In the case of Hungary, for example, the police were extremely brutal in 1944 in locating the Jews and rounding them up, and it was the Hungarian police, not the German police or the SS, who did this work. In the case of Italy, it was kind of the opposite. Whereas there were 11,000 or so Jews in Rome when Eichmann demanded them to be deported, the Italian police did nothing. They did not participate in the rounding up. They left it to the German police and, in fact, had warned Jews ahead of time that they needed to leave and escape or find opportunities for hiding. And so we know that of the 11,000 or so Jews in Rome, only around 1,000 were actually ever deported, which is remarkable because, again, the lack of complicity at a local level is what allowed them to be saved. And there was no reason why the police had to round the Jews up. The police were national police in Italy, and they didn't, so to speak, have to follow orders. All right, I'll come back to a number of these different pieces, but there's a lot to cover today, so I'm going to move to another example in Germany. Another example in Germany is student resistance. And this is, of course, obviously something that we can learn a lot about today, thinking about possibilities that, of what resistance looked like in the face of students and faculty banding together. Well, at the University of Munich in 1942, you had student activists working with faculty to distribute anti-Nazi leaflets throughout the University of Munich. They typed them up, they printed them, they distributed them in hallways, they distributed them in classrooms, and they expressed essentially outrage at the violence of Nazism and the regime. They expressed outrage at the mass murder of the Jews, which in 1942 was well known in Germany. They called for forms of resistance, they called for democracy, they called for freedoms, and they participated in teach-ins at the university, allied with different professors. They were found out. In fact, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, Christoph Probst, and others were put on trial. Sophie and Hans Scholl, this is her up here, this is Sophie Scholl. She was tried for treason in 1943 and in fact executed by the Nazi regime. So it didn't obviously end, it didn't unfortunately end well. But what they did was they wrote these leaflets that began to express a counter sentiment. They expressed a counter view. And I'll just quote from a couple of them because I think they're really so remarkable. And you have links on the website to all of them. Nothing, she says, and this is, imagining Sophie Scholl being one of the main authors here, is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct, meaning that's essentially become totalitarian, right? There's no more opposition. It is certain that today every honest German is ashamed of his government. 1942. Who among us has any conception of the dimensions of shame that will befall us and our children when one day the veil has fallen from our eyes and the horrible crimes that infinitely outdistance every human measure, reach the light of day? Every individual conscious of his responsibility as a member of Christian and Western civilization must defend himself against the scourges of mankind, against scourges of fascism and any similar system of totalitarianism. Offer passive resistance, wherever you may find it, to forestall the spread of this atheistic war machine before it's too late. Extraordinary, right? 1942. They literally printed these up. They had their own little printing machine in a classroom at the University of Munich, distributed them all around, and did this for almost a year to, again, raise public sentiment against Nazism. I had a link to a couple of the others that I wanted to show you. So these are the insignia of the White Rose Society is that, and you can almost see Sophie Scholl wearing it here. And in one of the other leaflets that she and her other student resistors wrote up, she talked about the struggle against the monstrousness of fascism and ways that this struggle would have to overturn the government, that it would have to convince good people that what they were doing was wrong. So you can read, all about this. I gave you a number of examples there. Let me go, so I can go back to that. But I wanted just to say that today she's recognized in Germany. So at the University of Munich, there's a number of memorials commemorating her work. One of the memorials consists of this, like it's on the ground and it's replicas of the actual leaflets that were distributed. And so it's a memorial that you can walk around and look at, as well as the building where they both lived until they were executed for their resistance. Another example of resistance, and this is also I find amazingly extraordinary, is a resistance protest in Berlin. Now you'd think, how could you have a resistance protest in Berlin in 1943? So at the height of the Holocaust, you have a group of German women, Aryan women, who were married to Jewish men protesting in Berlin. And so this is famously now been commemorated. This is again in Germany, this is in Berlin, this is a kind of a commemorative plaque that talks about the Rosenstrasse protest. And what happened was these women, Aryan women, were married to Jewish men. They were among the very last group of Jewish men in Berlin to be tracked and deported. And so the Gestapo rounded up this last group of Jewish men in 1943, all of whom were married to Aryan women. The women then went to the detention center where these men were rounded up in Rosenstrasse. They were detained for almost 2 weeks before they were going to be deported. They marched and chanted day in and day and night, calling for the release of their husbands, a very famous kind of protest, which was just, give us our husbands back. Now, this is amazing, because the SS could have done a couple of things. They could have shot all the women. They could have quelled the protest. They could have arrested them all. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of women who were there at different times. But Goebbels decided that this was causing too much public unrest in Germany in 1943, when the war machine wasn't going so well, and also where they decided that rather than continue to have this unrest, they would let the men go. And they did. Extraordinary. So you think to yourself, in 1943, it was possible for a group of women to protest in Berlin for the release of their Jewish husbands and to have succeeded. Extremely risky. It could have gone the other way. They could have all been imprisoned and sent off with their husbands. They could have been killed, but they weren't. And so it just begins to raise the question, is like, what are you prepared to risk? And is it possible to speak back to power? And it turns out, in some cases, it absolutely is. And in other cases, like Sophie Scholl, she did speak back to power, and she paid the price. She paid the price of her life. These women also spoke back to power. They were neither arrested, nor did they have their husbands deported. 1943. All right, so looking beyond Germany, so we're going to kind of broaden our scope since we have a lot to look at today. I want to talk about the case of Denmark and Sweden first, and then we'll turn to Bulgaria second. So, the facts. Hitler invades Denmark and Norway in 1940, early 1940. There are not a lot of Jews in Denmark. There's about a little more than 7,000 Jews in Denmark. The Danish king sort of made a strategic decision. Rather than to abdicate the throne, he decided that he was going to collaborate with the Nazis in some ways. And what that essentially meant was that the king and the elected government stayed in Denmark, but that they would collaborate with Nazi wishes. And in 1943, one of those wishes was to round up and deport all of the Danish Jews. Well, there was also a Danish resistance movement already underway in Denmark, partially with ordinary citizens, partially the police, partially government officials, and they were tipped off ahead of time to this impending roundup of the Jews. They didn't have a lot of time. They had a couple of days, but because they were tipped off, a response could be created, and that response was the Jews were literally smuggled out of Denmark on fishing boats across the water to Sweden. Sweden had remained neutral in the war, had agreed to take Jews, had agreed to harbor and safeguard Jews. All 7,200 Jews, by ordinary fishermen, shipped off to Sweden. They were put in homes, churches were involved, hospitals were involved, and Sweden accepted all these Jews as part of, as essentially people fleeing, refugees essentially fleeing from an occupied country. They all survived. Now the case of Sweden is really interesting because Sweden didn't have a very large, had almost no Jews, a very negligible Jewish population when you look at the rest of Europe. But they accepted Jews. That's like they accepted Jewish refugees, not only from Norway and Denmark and Finland, but they also, and this is very significant, they also issued protective passports and certifications on behalf of the government to Jews in Hungary during a critical time, and that was the time when Eichmann was orchestrating the deportation of the Jews out of Hungary to Auschwitz. And so Sweden, and particularly, this is Wallenberg here, he was a Swedish diplomat. He was stationed in Budapest towards the end of the war. This is 1944. This is the high point of the deportation of more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews. that Eichmann was carrying out. Almost all of the Jews that were sent to Birkenau. They were killed, except for the tens of thousands of Jews that got protection by the Swedish government because of certifications and passports that Wallenberg issued at the behest of the Swedish government. And so he wasn't even going against government policy. Government policy was to issue these protective passports. That also meant that not only were they able to stay within Swedish, not only could possibly leave, some did leave, but many were not able to leave, and so they were put into Swedish buildings, Swedish safe houses throughout Budapest, and he was the one that personally authorized these certifications. He's credited by Yad Vashem and others with saving perhaps tens of thousands of Jews in this last moment of the deportation campaign from Auschwitz, to Auschwitz. So I want to turn to the case of Bulgaria, and I want to spend a little bit more time on this because this is a very complicated case, and I think perhaps there's a lot that we can learn from trying to understand the debates that were happening at all levels of the government and church in Bulgaria about how to save or whether to save the Jews. So I'll spend a bit more time on this now. So I mentioned, in a prior class that almost all of the Bulgarian Jewish population survived, about 48,000 Jews. And they survived because of a number of, I'd say, very fragile, even precarious set of circumstances. It wasn't a foregone conclusion at all that they would survive. One, because the Bulgarian king, Boris III, was allied with the Nazis. They were part of the Axis powers. They had a kind of proto-fascist government. And it wasn't exactly clear that the king would not comply with Eichmann's orders for deportation. Well, part of the reason why this played out the way it did was because of a number of key people, particularly a man by the name of Dimitar Peshev, who was the Minister of Justice and Deputy Speaker of the Bulgarian National Assembly, so essentially their parliament, that he took it upon himself to create a kind of a statement signed by many other members of the Bulgarian majority, the ruling party, and essentially advocate to the king that they shouldn't be deporting a group of their own citizens. Now, this argument is very important because the Bulgarians thought the Jews were primarily first Bulgarians and second, they were Jews. They weren't first Jews and then Bulgarians. And this argument made a very significant difference in the course of what happened there. And as we'll see in a moment, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church spoke out in a number of dramatic cases against the deportation. And this became very important, something that we didn't see with regard to the Catholic Church in Germany speaking out in the same kind of way. At the same time, I do want to say, and this is important to understand the context, is that Bulgarian Jews that were Bulgarian nationals were not deported. But Jews in territories that were occupied by Bulgaria, particularly in eastern Serbia, Greece, and Macedonia, were deported. And so around 13,000 Jews in those occupied areas were killed in Treblinka. So let's look sort of where this is. So this is Bulgaria. It lies next to the Black Sea. We're talking about an area that's south of Romania. Sofia is the capital of Bulgaria, right here. The vast majority of the Jews in Bulgaria live in Sofia. It's a very small group of people, about 48,000. This constitutes less than 1% of the entire population. Most of the Jews are artisans in craft and other kind of work. They're, as you know from maybe some of the readings, they were not professionals in the sense of they weren't lawyers or politicians. They were relatively, so to speak, working class. When Bulgaria annexed parts of former Yugoslavia, this is Macedonia, a number of Jews came under their control here. Part from Greece, a number of Jews came under control there, and part from Romania, which is eastern Serbia. The Jews in these three more purple regions, those Jews were all deported and killed. The Jews in Bulgaria were not. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So as some background information, and I already provided this for you, I mentioned that the king was part of made the decision in 1941 to join the Axis powers. So Germany, Italy, Japan occupied a number of areas in Greece and Macedonia and passed a law which was contested. But it's a law that sort of was like the Nuremberg laws in Germany, called the Law for the Defense of the Nation. And this law had anti-Jewish legislation, provisions like forbidding marriage between Jews and Bulgarians, treating them as second-class citizens, taxing them in certain ways, expropriating their property. And so you already see a country that's teetering on the edge of an anti-Semitism that's probably looking in 1941 to go in the direction that these Jews are all going to probably be killed. And that's interesting because it doesn't go entirely in that direction, but it could have, and it was very close. So these kind of anti-Jewish laws, inflicted things like curfews. Jews had to wear the yellow star. They were conscripted into work gangs and actually in slave labor. Their property was taken from them, and they were mass evicted from their homes. So things for these Jews in Bulgaria were not great. And you can't say that Bulgaria was just, strictly a heroic country. But there is a kind of heroism that I find to be in the actions of certain members of the National Parliament, or National Assembly, and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. And I think we have to kind of confront that within the context of what was a much kind of an anti-Semitic legislation that was put into place. So what happened? Well, Eichmann sends a representative to Bulgaria in 1943, early on. It's a man named Theodor Danaker, SS officer, there to begin to work with Bulgarian officials, particularly the guy who actually drafted this law for the defense of the nation, part of the Bulgarian Fascist Party, Belev, to identify the Jews for deportation. They identify a lot of Jews from the occupied territories, around 14,000 of them. Those Jews are from, like I said, Thrace and Greece and Macedonia. Almost all of those Jews are killed in Treblinka. And then they also identify a first round of around 6,000 Bulgarian national Jews from Bulgaria proper. Those Jews are not deported. And in fact, none of the 48,000 Jews from Bulgaria will in the end be deported. But Eichmann wanted them to be. He sent someone there to do it. He sent them to begin to work with the fascist party in Bulgaria to begin to start the process. Well, the readings that I gave you for today are readings that, again, show sort of some of the thought, the strategy, in stopping this. They come from a book by the name of Fragility of Goodness by a linguist named Todorov. And in there, I gave you some readings by a number of people, one by Dimitar Peshev and a couple by the metropolitans of the Bulgarian church. The metropolitans are like bishops, and so they're in charge. There were 11 of these different metropolitans throughout Bulgaria, and their leadership was extremely important in shaping the response to the so-called Jewish question in Bulgaria. So first, reactions. And then again, I'm thinking in terms of resistance. Well, there were many reactions to this law of 1940 against the law for the defense of the nation. A writers' union, I provide this reading to you, argued that it was a terrible idea to pass this bill because it would essentially deprive a Bulgarian minority of its civil rights. It would enslave one part of the Bulgarian citizens, they said. A lawyers' union similarly argued that the Constitution expressly forbids the separation of Bulgarian citizens into inferior and superior categories. They say the Bulgarian Jews have never threatened our economy, our culture, and such a law contradicts the freedom and democratic spirit of the Bulgarian people. And so already there was a number of unions that, by the way, had no Jews as a part of them, who spoke out against this law. But the law was passed. The law was passed in 1940, put into action in 1941, and so already the Bulgarians are moving in that direction of treating the Jews as second-class citizens. The Bulgarian Orthodox Church also spoke out against this law. Now, initially what they were concerned with is that the law made no distinction between baptized Jews, who adopted the Christian faith and what they called Israelite Jews, essentially Jews that had not been baptized. But it does argue that this law is of no use for the nation, that no minority needs to be targeted, and they also say that you need to modify the law to protect all the Bulgarian citizens of Jewish origin who, one, have accepted the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and second, to take no actions against those Jews as a national minority unless a real danger exists, meaning any Jew, regardless of whether they're baptized or not. Again, they already spoke out against this law in 1940. The law passes nevertheless. So King Boris ratifies it or signs it into law, and among the things that happen are, against marriage, Jews had to change their names, rules about where they can live, what kind of jobs they can have, they're excluded from schools, professional activities. These are very similar to what's happening in Germany in 1935, 36, 37, 38. Very similar kind of laws about the exclusion of the Jews. Well, 1943 comes, and Eichmann is ready to deport the Bulgarian Jews. A number of examples of resistance began to come forward. The most important was the one by Peshev that I mentioned, where he gets 42 members of the government majority to sign a letter brought directly to the prime minister and then the king against this deportation order. Should also say that other public figures, including the underground press and the widow of the ex-prime minister, also spoke out, and that the police in Bulgaria were generally lenient with regard to rounding up the Jews. That is to say, they didn't actively pursue any of the roundup orders. And finally, the church. So let's look at the first thing, the letter, the protest letter. So this is by the prime minister. This is a letter to the prime minister by Peshev, signed by 42 members. And what they do, and I think strategically it's really interesting, what he's trying to do in this letter is first establish their loyalty to the king. So this is strategically interesting. You could say that to the king, we're not loyal to you, we disagree with you, we don't want to do anything to support you. But he says, no, first establish that you're loyal to the regime, you're loyal to its general policy, you recognize the importance of the security of the state, and the argument here is that the women, the children, the elderly, these Jews, potentially any Jews, are guilty of no crime whatsoever, right? He says that we cannot share any responsibility for the deportation, that this decision itself would be exceptional, uncruel, unwarranted, and excessive, because the Jews are Bulgarian citizens and they cannot be expelled from their own country. Right? This is a really interesting argument. They're Bulgarian citizens and cannot be expelled from their own country. Now, he does two things in this letter. One, he allies himself with the majority and the king. And two, he says that these citizens, these Jews, are first and foremost Bulgarian citizens, and that this policy would be contradictory to our constitution. We'll come back to that in a second. What's the Bulgarian Orthodox Church say? Well, they speak out, one, to protect not just the baptized Jews, but Jews in general. One of the metropolitans, and again, these are like bishops, presents the facts in a special session of the church, a special kind of almost emergency session, in which he argues that he has to basically practice a form of civil disobedience because his conscience has told him so, his Christian conscience. I'm going to read you what he says because I think it's so powerful. He says that this is March of 1943, he reports to his other metropolitans. He says, around 1,500 or 1,600 Jews were arrested in Plovdiv, which is the area where he's the bishop. They were assembled in a schoolhouse and were to be sent to Poland, like the Jews from the new territories of Thrace and Macedonia. I learned about this later in the day. A special train was supposed to arrive at the station to take them away. There was widespread indignation among the public. All I could do was act in accordance with the decisions and instructions of the Holy Synod and follow the voice of my conscience. And so what does he do? I sent a telegram to His Majesty the King, begging him in God's name to have pity on these unfortunate people. I then asked to speak to the chief of police. When I was unable to contact him, I contacted the district police chief. And when he too was unavailable, I decided to call his assistant, and I politely urged them to let the government know that I, who until now have always been loyal to the government, now reserve the right to act with a free hand in this manner and heed only the dictates of my conscience. He then talks about giving Jews asylum in his own home and talks about the fact that this is an example of being Christian. He says, I was following the example of the first Christians who not only rescued their own, but also took up collections among themselves to buy the freedom of foreign-born Christian slaves. So, extraordinary testimony that he gives at the meeting of all the bishops. Furthermore, another bishop, Metropolitan Stephan, says, the Jews know well that there's no one to speak for them except the Bulgarian church, and as she acts forcefully, her voice will be heard, because Bulgarian was 99% Bulgaria is part of the Orthodox Church. And so the church knew that they had power and authority within Bulgaria. And the fact is that these men who spoke out on behalf of the Jews did so with a voice that would be heard, that he could contact the king and the police as testament to exactly that. Now, with regard to Peshev and his memorandum that was signed by others, I think it's important to also understand a little bit more about his strategy. And so I said earlier that he brought this resolution to the National Assembly in 1943, but what he says was his strategy was to draw his support from the majority party. It wasn't to oppose the king or from the opposition party. He wanted to actually get people on board that were essentially of the same party, the king, thinking that this would be less likely to destabilize the government. And so the king would be more willing to listen to people that were part of his own party. It's a good strategy, very thoughtful strategy. And the idea here, focusing on a single disagreement of policy, not a question of confidence in the government. And so you have the Bulgarian church, you have Peshev and the 42 members of the majority, you have the police not enforcing the deportations to the same extent. All this combined is what gave the possibility of the Jews not being deported. And by the end of 43, when the war began to take a turn where it looked like Germany was not going to win the war, they didn't pursue the Bulgarian Jews any further. They survived. All right. So the last part of my lecture today is actually about four people, four individuals. Four very different individuals, but I have about 20 minutes, so maybe like 5 minutes apiece. And hopefully then we'll have some time for some questions or discussion. But I wanted to talk about four people that did things, kinds of resistance, really based on the very specific circumstances that they were in. One, Avraham Sutzkever, who we've already met last week, a poet, and particularly his role in the Partisans, which was a group of Jewish resistance fighters, numbering at its height probably around 30,000 men and women who lived in the forests, primarily outside of Vilna and other cities behind Soviet lines, and who blew up train stations, ammunitions, got killed to a certain extent German soldiers, and worked essentially as a kind of almost a paramilitary group. And there were examples of partisans throughout Europe, but the largest group was outside of Vilna. And so we'll look at a poem that he wrote, kind of almost like a rallying cry of sort for the partisans. Then we'll talk about a librarian at the University of Vilna and her role in saving Jews. Talk about Shione Sugihara and his role in issuing transit visas for Jews. And then finally, Irina Sendler. So those are the four. All of them risked something. And this, I think, is very important to think when we think about resistance. They were prepared to risk something, but they also knew something about the very specific kind of power that they had in their professional role. So you remember Vilna, I showed you this slide last week, but Vilna was it's kind of seen as the Jerusalem of Lithuania because it was a place where you have a tremendous amount of Jewish cultural heritage. Major poets like Chaim Bialik or Yiddish writers like Sholem Aleichem, artists like Marc Chagall had come from there. And by 1943, most of the Jews had been killed by Einsatz commandos, murdered outside of Vilna in the forests, and the Jews that were left were primarily in ghettos. The partisan organization formed in 1942, and this is a photo from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum of example of what these partisans look like, often procuring weapons as best they could, living in the forests for years on end in makeshift houses and shelters, operating behind German lines and sabotaging the war effort. I'm going to play you a small citation from a woman who was part of the partisans, and this is a testimony that's really, I think, really quite interesting. Just very short.
The partisans were at the edge of the forest. They were not in the main group. What they were basically doing is disrupting communications. Communications meaning train deliveries. They would go out and loosen the bolts to some of the railroad tracks so the train could not go on. Disrupting the delivery to the front lines. Sometimes managing to blow up a couple of carloads of ammunition. It always had to be done in a manner that would not be too suspicious, that kind of could be accepted as possibly even an accident because of retaliation.
So Sutzkever penned in 1943 what's sometimes seen as one of the most kind of eloquent moments of transformation of Jews in terms of the kind of cultural traditions that they had built up in Vilna into the partisans. And in this poem called The Lead Plates of the Rome Printers, he kind of mythologizes. This may not have actually taken place as he imagines it here, but he imagines taking the printing plates that were used to print the Talmud, that were used to print Jewish, the Hebrew Bible, that were used probably to print poetry, imagines melting down those printing plates, the lead, and turning that lead into bullets. And those bullets would be used to kill Nazis. And so there's an extraordinary poem from the Vilna ghetto shortly before he escaped in 1943 into the forests as part of the partisans. And I won't read actually I will read it to you. It's a short poem. So he says, like fingers stretched out through the bars in the night to catch the free light of the air that is shed, we sneak in the dark to grab up, as in spite, the Rome's printing plates with old wisdom and bread. We dreamers now have to be soldiers and fight and melt into bullets the soul of the lead. And now once again we broke open the seal of a strangely familiar, a timeless dark cave. And armored in shadows with candles concealed, we poured out the letters in lead lines engraved. Thus in that temple our forefathers wheeled the golden menorahs, poured in the oil that was saved. Liquid lead brightly shining in bullets so fine, ancient thoughts in letters that melted hot, a line from Babylonia, from Poland a line, boiled, flooded together in the foundry pot. Jewish valor hidden in word and sign must now explode the whole world with a shot. And he who saw Jewish youth in their prime clutching the weapons in ghetto halls, he saw the last struggle of Yerushalayim. The heroic fall of these granite walls took in the words poured in lead out of time and heard in his heart the ancient voice calls. It's a kind of taking, again, those melting the plates with their wisdom. I mean, this is essentially a reference to the Babylonian Talmud, references to Jewish law, the books that were printed, the cultural traditions, the religious traditions, and in a moment of great need, right, in a moment of overwhelming horror, to take anything that's left, essentially take that cultural tradition, essentially melt it down and turn it into bullets that could be used to fight the Nazis. And so this is, he went to the forests and in fact survived the war. So simultaneously, and this is kind of like almost the flip side in some ways to this imaginary of melting down the plates, you have a woman, a non-Jewish librarian who worked at Vilna University, who decided that it was very important to save the historical documents of the Vilna ghetto. So works of literature, history, letters, diaries, things that were written by Jews who were in the ghetto, but also things that they had in their homes, the great works. She went into the ghetto under the pretext of being a librarian. So essentially she's like, I'm a librarian. I have to recover these books from these Jewish students or from these faculty members or from these people who have books. And as she recovered books and got documents, she also took letters and diaries into the Vilna ghetto, into the Vilna library, as kind of testimony of what people were experiencing. At the same time, she smuggled food and other provisions into the ghetto. She did this for almost more than a year. And she hid the documents that she got out of the ghetto in the library. She writes in one of the letters that I gave you, in the attics, under stairs, concealed among books, essentially testimony that had to be gotten out of the Vilna ghetto and brought to the light of day, except the light of day was some future that she couldn't have possibly have known. But this is the most significant thing, perhaps, is that she hid Jews in the library, right? In the stacks. Totally amazing. And she talks about how she brought night buckets because you couldn't use the toilet, that people literally had to go to the bathroom in buckets that she would carry out at nighttime, and that these Jews were there for months on end in the stacks of the library. And if you're familiar with how stacks of the library work in Europe, most people can't go in except librarians. So it wasn't like you could just go to the stacks and just browse around. The librarian was a kind of gateway. And she recognized that she, as a librarian, had this power over the stacks. She could not only hide documents, but she could hide people there. And she did so for months at end, bringing them food and whatnot. Amazingly, she was captured in 1944. She was sent to Dachau, but she survived. And many of the Jews that she helped also survived. So it's, again, someone thinking about their professional situation. It's like, I'm just a librarian. What could I do? Well, it turns out there's some kind of even power within that organization that allowed you to do something, really remarkable. Last two people. Shione Sugihara. This is the story of a Japanese consul general stationed in Lithuania who began issuing, in 1940, emergency transit visas for Jews to leave Lithuania via the Trans-Siberian Railway. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that by 1940, there was almost no country in the world that was going to take Jewish refugees. Jewish refugees were denied entry into the United States in the late 1930s. They were denied entry into almost every other country in the world. And so the one place they could go in 1940 was Shanghai, China. And part of the reason for this is that Shanghai was also under occupation by Japan and had a kind of provisional government in place and was accepting Jewish asylum seekers. And so what Sugihara did was he issued visas that were both entry and exit visas and transit visas for Jews to leave Lithuania, and for their entire families, in fact, at the expressly against the request of Tokyo, who basically, and I quote this telegram at the bottom there, because he was told by his higher-ups in Tokyo that what you're doing, this is from the Foreign Ministry office, is not what what Japan wants. We're not allowing this. And yet he continued to authorize and stamp these visas for Jews that had requested them to leave. And so they say, concerning transit visas requested previously, stop. Advise absolutely not to be issued any traveler not holding firm N visa with guaranteed departure. Ex-Japan, stop. No exceptions, stop. No further inquiries expected, stop. Signed K. Tanaka of the Foreign Ministry. Now, most of these Jews, and we know that around 6,000 received transit visas from Sugihara within a period of just a few months, all left Lithuania, made their way primarily by train and the Trans-Siberian Railway. Many ended up first in Japan and then finally back into Shanghai. And because of his insubordination, he actually did lose his job, and his career was largely ruined even after the war. But to this day, if you count the number of families that were saved, 6,000 people because of the actions of Sugihara. And apparently there's even memories of people remembering him issuing these visas as he was leaving Lithuania on the train to Jews, throwing them out. He left his stamp actually with the Jews in Lithuania so that they could create forged passports. So amazing, kind of like, what do I do? And someone who found, something to do. There's a memorial, by the way, in LA, in Little Tokyo, if you ever wanted to visit it, to Sugihara. So the last person that I'm going to talk about today is Irina Sendler, whose story, unfortunately, hasn't been as well known as maybe Oskar Schindler, who did a similar thing, but his story is extremely significant. So she lived in Warsaw, and she had worked in the social welfare department in Warsaw. She was non-Jewish, she was Catholic. She worked with Catholic charities throughout Warsaw. And if you remember the kind of population about Warsaw, before the war, we're talking about 350,000 Jews there. Most were sent to Treblinka, and by 1942-43, you're talking about only 60 or so thousand Jews remaining in Warsaw. She worked for an organization called Zagota, and I mentioned that earlier. It was a Catholic organization called, and just generally considered a council for the aid to the Jews. And it was allied with the Polish underground, particularly to provide assistance to Jews who were in the Warsaw Ghetto. So what you had was that 350,000 Jews had been crammed into a small ghetto, only 16 square blocks. They were extremely malnourished, there was a lot of disease, and she received the permission that she had to go into the ghetto was based on the pretext that she had to stop the spread of disease. And there was tremendous typhoid, tuberculosis, many other diseases, and that potentially this would create an epidemic, within Warsaw itself. And so she received permission to go in and out of the ghetto. She received permission as well to bring material into the ghetto, particularly medicine. And she also had the opportunity to smuggle, and this is interesting, children out. She did this primarily in ambulances. So she went in as part of essentially their Center for Disease Control, their epidemic control department. And the children, as we now know, were smuggled out essentially in the ambulance, sometimes in garbage cans and potato sacks, even coffins. And she placed them all 2,500 of the children that she smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto, with adoptive families throughout Warsaw. And this was primarily an ally with the Catholic Church, and the story of what she did is kind of been well documented, and it's been primarily since she died in 2008. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, in fact, didn't get it. But her story has now been well documented in a series of plays and other things. She gave the children new names. She found adoptive families for them. And the idea would be that one day they would find out who they were. And so she buried their names in little jars, apparently in her neighbor's yard. These jars could be dug up after the war, and they could essentially find out who they were. She was arrested. In fact, found out by the Gestapo. She was tortured. And the organization itself, Zagota, actually bribed the Nazi officers to spare her life. But insofar as she's credited today by Yad Vashem and others with saving 2,500 children. So, to conclude, we have to think a lot about what do these stories have in common. I think one thing they have in common is that they all realized that they had some kind of power specific to their circumstances and professional situation. And that power might have been, I'm just a librarian, but I have power in the sense that I control access to the stacks. I have power, I can go in and out of the ghetto. I have power in my professional organization. I have the ability to advocate. I have connections. I can call up the police officers. I can call up the chief of police because I'm a bishop in the church. So they recognized and used that power to the greatest extent possible. I would say as well, they were prepared to risk their professional future. And they did so by practicing forms of civil disobedience in which we couldn't see what the future would bring. And so when those women in Germany, in Rosenstrasse in 1943, were protesting for the return of their husbands, I suspect some of them, if not all of them, thought that they would probably be arrested. So there was a risk. Everything's on the line. And yet, it turned out that they weren't arrested at all. How do we know? Again, human beings create power, and human beings can also disrupt power. They all had to see and act beyond the present. They had to see beyond their circumstances. They had to think of a future that was different than their present. And I'd say they created allies, often with those in power, and when it wasn't possible, they went it on their own. You think of the case of Sophie Scholl and the student activists at the University of Munich. They went on their own at some point, and again, they paid the highest price. So I'll leave you with that. Examples of resistance. Resistance did exist. It's remarkable how much it existed. Any questions? Thoughts?